live from the Millvale Studios. It's Friday morning, and it's Gajtka Game. This is our latest edition, right here on the River's Edge, found at riversedgepgh.com, and I'm your host, Matt Gajtka. Brian Crawford on the ones and twos back there. Always appreciate that, and we treasure your listenership every Friday, 8 a.m., sometimes live, sometimes not so live, but today, happy to be in the studio and always enjoy doing it in real time. Coming up later in this hour, we'll have your usual things that you've come to expect from Gajtka Game, including Ban the Cliche. I've got a beauty for you that ties in with the return of the hockey season. Also, the final number, wrapping up what has been a volatile year for the Pirates. Just a few games left to go at home, and just a week and a half to go in the regular season, and almost assuredly that will end the season for the Buccos. Also, some football talk. My guest will help me with that. The expert witness this morning is my colleague at DKPittsburghSports.com, Lance Lysowski, the young man from Youngstown, Ohio, a place that I've lived and worked in the past, that midway point between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. But he's working in the Burgh these days, went to Kent State, used to write for the Washington Observer Reporter. Now he's with us, covering the Pitt Panthers and filling in on a whole bunch of other things, similar to a role that I was in about a year ago at the site. So he's not afraid to spread his wings and go into a few different topics, not just the one that he's paid to cover for our website. And whatever else comes to mind will be on the table throughout the following 60 minutes. But for today's opening argument, I have an argument in favor of more, and I'm always in favor of more in the world of sports, as long as it's the right kind of more. And for me, the right kind of more means events like the World Cup of Hockey, which I have enjoyed. I mean the right kind of more in terms of expansion. Yes, I am in favor of expansion of sports leagues, and I'll get to the reasoning in just a moment, but also I'm for more in the ways of additional variety. Not more of the same, but more in terms of trying to make the product, pro or college sports, better. I can't stand the status quo mentality. That's not who I am. I've always been someone who wants to try to improve things. If you're not trying to get better, you're probably getting worse. That seems to be the case in almost any part of life, but I think particularly in a competitive entertainment field like sports, and status quo just isn't in my genes. I've always been one to experiment, and whether it's my own personal life, professionally, recreationally, I've always been one to tinker with my golf swing, tinker with my fitness plan. I am not hesitant to try anything that might improve my quality of life in a variety of ways. And because of that, I can forgive sins of commission more than sins of omission. If you're following what I'm putting down there, I mean, if you do something and you're wrong, I can always forgive that, or even more pointedly, I can empathize with that mindset, more so than just sitting back and waiting for things to happen. At least, in my mind, you're trying to do something instead of just sitting back and waiting. And as I watched the World Cup of Hockey over the past week or so on ESPN, which has been fun to see the four-letter network get back into the hockey business, if only for a couple of weeks. And speaking of that, one of the hockey advocates on ESPN, John Buchagras, a man who's from the Ohio Valley like myself. He's from Steubenville, Ohio. I'm just across the river, grew up just across the river in Weirton, West Virginia, but he and I don't always agree on things, but I'm completely with him on the idea that more is better in terms of hockey, in terms of football, baseball, basketball, lacrosse, whatever you got going on, golf, tennis. And he always says that in the realm of expansion, and I'll get to that. But I think more to the point for me this morning, the World Cup of Hockey is just the type of thing that a sport like hockey needs. And I've always been envious of the sport of soccer, and I do follow soccer, but not as closely internationally as some do these days. I'm a fan of the sport, but I have long been an admirer of how they can weave in these international tournaments, these cups, into their so-called regular seasons. We are, in many ways, in North American pro sports especially, a slave to the regular season, and there's no room for anything else, particularly international competition. That has always fascinated me, and even in a somewhat contrived event like the World Cup of Hockey, which includes a team like Team Europe, which is an amalgamation of several nations that didn't have enough players individually to field competitive teams, or especially in the case of Team North America, which is a group of American and Canadian players, 23 and younger. That's about as artificial as it gets, but they might have been the most exciting team, and I think they gave this World Cup a selling point that a tournament like the Olympics, which I also love in many, many ways, not just in hockey or say you go to the Summer Olympics this past time in Rio, golf and tennis, certainly taking the stage in bigger ways, and golf for the first time in practically a century. But with the World Cup of Hockey, it's new, it's different, and for me, it adds some flavor to a sport that always has been, as I mentioned, privy to that 82-game grind. And anything you can do to mix that up, I've always thought 82 games is a little too long. 6 months for a regular season is a little too long. I believe that with baseball as well. I think we can knock down 162 in order to give everyone a little bit more of a break, a little bit of a refresher. And that applies across all sports, with the possible exception of football. I wouldn't go any more than 16 games. But again, I would be in favor of anything that repositions the sport, anything that allows players to get outside of playing for their club. Playing for country is typically the go-to when we do mix it up, and I have enjoyed the World Cup for that reason. Also, though, if I may expand my theme of more being better, I always hear more negatives than positives when expansion is proposed, and I'm not just speaking of the NHL, I'm talking about baseball too. Perhaps one day Montreal will get a team back. I've heard lobbies or proposals in favor of places like Austin, Texas, of all cities, to get a Major League Baseball team in the future. And I don't have a problem with it, because for me, if you're trying to grow the game, which is, I believe, always the goal, whether it be football, baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, anything, the goal should be to grow the game, to grow your market from just a purely capitalistic perspective. And it's always easier to get into a sport when you have a local team to root for. And I was fortunate growing up around the area, having teams like the Penguins, the Pirates, and the Steelers. Those are your anchors. Those are your attractors to the sport. And I wouldn't have come up playing hockey. I wouldn't have been as big of a baseball fan if I didn't have local teams to latch onto, to become fans of. And for me, when this new Las Vegas team, the Las Vegas whatevers, they continue to put off their official naming, but a year from now when the Las Vegas NHL team takes the ice, it'll be a plus for the NHL and the sport, and we can bloviate, we can worry about what that means for the competitive balance of the league. Is there enough talent to maintain the level? I think there is. That's maybe a debate for another time. But all those concerns are secondary to getting the product in front of more eyeballs and getting people more emotionally tied into the sport. And you can say, well, Las Vegas has already had some of the better ratings outside of an NHL market for the product. But once you get that local team, for me, there's no replacement for falling in love with the players that compete in your area. And I realize that geography becomes less and less important in these days of new media, social media, proliferation of video coverage of these events, of audio if you want to listen to it. There's so many ways to access your team. But for me, always the easiest way to get attached to become a fan is to, number one, attend in person, but also, number two, have a group of like-minded folks around the area in which you can commiserate, in which you can relate. So I will always be in favor of growing leagues, and of course there is a limit to that. You can't put an NHL team in Fargo, North Dakota, or maybe you could. Maybe they would attract fans. Perhaps that's a bad example. Using the baseball example, you can't put an NHL team, or I wouldn't at least, in Austin, Texas, even though they do have an AHL team, an American Hockey League team at the moment. But as long as the markets are viable, as long as you're not guaranteed to wash out of the market in 3 to 5 years, then I say give it a shot. Again, sins of commission rather than sins of omission. It shows that you're trying. It shows that you're giving it a shot. And if I may tie it back into international play, especially in an international sport like hockey, like soccer, like baseball, the World Baseball Classic returns next spring. Yes, it does extend the season for many players, and that makes it more like soccer too. If you notice, international soccer does not have that long of an off season. If there's a World Cup year or a major tournament going on in the summer, like Euro 2016 that just went on for the European nations, then you might have a month and a half off tops before the club season gets started again. But if you can work in holiday breaks, if you can work in refreshers like on the baseball side, the World Baseball Classic, which shall return in February and March next year, I think that's for the benefit, and it doesn't feel that monotonous. It doesn't feel like, oh, it's just another game. There's so much regular season. There's so much regular, period, in all of our pro sports, with the possible exception of football, like I said, once a week for 16 weeks, and then maybe an extra month if your team is lucky. But if you go outside of that, if you go into, if you take a different perspective on it, if it is a cup or a tournament interspersed throughout the season, it would be a welcome refresher for me, for the players, I think, too, a different way of looking at it, and also for the fans. And I would not go any more than 82 games in hockey for a regular season. I would not go more than 162, certainly not for baseball. But I would be in favor, and I would advocate for additional tournaments, things that put the sport in front of new sets of eyeballs. Great case in point with the World Cup of Hockey. ESPN used to be the network for hockey, at least on the cable side, and if you wanted to watch a game throughout the year, you had at least a couple per week. That's not the case anymore, but if any casual sports fan, if any ESPN viewer stumbled into hockey and they liked what they saw, especially with the exciting Team North America over the course of the past 2 weeks, then I think it's worth it. I think that you have to call it an unmitigated success. It is about growth, and it's a competitive entertainment landscape, and there's no guarantee that in 20, 30, 40, 50 years that pro sports or team sports are going to be popular. There's no guarantee that with all these entertainment options we have, with, as I mentioned, social media, it can help team sports. It can make that connection stronger, but it can also give us an alternative. And there wasn't Netflix 20 years ago that you could just stay in and have a good time in your house. There are so many ways that you can be entertained without being attached to a pro sports team or league. So I think you've got to get creative if you are in the administration, if you are running any of these sports. And with the way the NHL and the NHL Players Association put on the World Cup of Hockey, I think that's a pretty decent blueprint for making a new way to get people involved in the future. We'll take a step back. I'll come back with Ban the Cliche. We'll have a short segment before we lead into my expert witness, Lance Lysowski. This will be tied into what I was just talking about. Hockey's back, but unfortunately one of the worst cliches in hockey has made its return, and I'll get into that in greater detail in just a moment on The River's Edge.
Hi, I'm Mike Storer, host of The Awesome Cast, which you can hear right here on River's Edge Radio. We're talking tech, getting geeky every week with people from Pittsburgh in the industry. Go check us out, awesomecast.net, or listen to us right here on River's Edge Radio, Thursday mornings, 8 a.m. after Funny Money.
Hey, it's Matt Gajtka back with segment number 2 of Gajk's Got Game on the River's Edge, located at riversedgepgh.com. Thank you for listening and watching. If you are doing so, we have a myriad of ways for which you can do that. Easiest way to find the live stream is riversedgepgh.com, though. We are Facebook Live on this Friday morning, Friday, September 23rd. Just about a week left in the 9th month, and we have officially transitioned over into fall, which pleases my engineer and producer very much, Brian Crawford. He railed against autumn a couple of weeks ago when I was on his River Talk program. River Talk will be part of the Pittsburgh Pod Crawl coming up. That'll be, next Saturday, correct? Brian, yeah, he can chime in.
This Friday, or not this Friday, but next Friday,
okay.
September 30th, which is actually International Podcast Day.
Oh, okay. That's the tie-in. I will miss it. I'll be in St. Louis. I cover the Pirates for DKPittsburghSports.com. So that's the final weekend. I can't exactly miss the final weekend of the season, even though I would probably at this point like to pawn that trip off. My Thundering Herd of Marshall are playing Pitt that Saturday, too. That doesn't happen very often, but I will miss that as well. So my best regards to Pitt. Yeah, Brian, I was looking at the wrong calendar here. We still have July up on the wall.
Yeah,
so.
Well, the thing is, I don't use that calendar, so I never think to change it.
Okay, fair enough. Anyway, quick segment here before we go to this week's expert witness, Lance Lysowski, my colleague at DKPS.com. Ban the cliche, and I talked quite a bit of hockey in the opening segment. I never need an excuse for that. But one thing that really irritated me this week was the reemergence of this 4-word cliche that describes expert goaltending, standing on his head. I don't believe I've ever talked about this on this show, but I forgot how just insipid this phrase is. I'm sure at one time it was very original and cute, and it had some sort of freshness to it, but wow, has this one been beaten down. And with the return of hockey comes the reemergence of this absolute Hall of Fame cliche. You could put it at the top of the list for me in the department of things that make me cringe. And it's like there is literally no other way to describe a goalie playing exceedingly well. And it got to the point this week on an ESPN broadcast that Steve Levy, who I like a lot, and Barry Melrose, who whatever, used it in back-to-back sentences. One said it, then the other said it. Please, mix it up. You're professional broadcasters. Do something different. Standing on his head, again, at one time, I'm sure that was a fun bit of imagery. And we can imagine, oh, wow, the guy's being really acrobatic, such and such. So he's practically standing on his head. And sure, all cliches, I think, start off well-intentioned and might start off with a bit of newness to them. And like I said in my previous segment, I'm not in favor of trying something, or not against trying something new. But you have to realize when it's played out, when it has jumped the shark, to use an entertainment cliche. There's one that I don't mind as much as standing on his head for whatever reason. But hey, it's my show. I make the rules here on Gajk's Got Game. And it's just a lesson that a good thing, or what was at one time a good thing, can turn into a bad thing when it's worn down to the nub. So please, hockey broadcasters, and oh, God help us writers, if you use that in written language, there's more punishment to come your way. But if you're on the air, I get it. Sometimes you struggle to come up with words and ways to describe, but do something, anything other than standing on his head. Break time on Gajk's Got Game. Lance Lysowski, my fellow Polish-American, will join me in just a few moments. Until then, enjoy this local track.
Stay clear of the streets, for God's sake! The timid and the fearful drivers are every bit as bad as the aggressive drivers. Nobody in Pittsburgh knows what a right-of-way is. I go down the road and I just sing this song, the gas is on the right, the gas is on the right. Hi-ho the highway, yo! The gas is on the right.
Get educated with Brian Crawford live Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
You heard it. He'll be with you later on this morning. Brian Crawford After pulling a night shift, he's in here with me. Got to appreciate that. And he'll be with you, speaking with you about, well, nothing's off the table for River Talk, and particularly when it has a local bet. And we will get to that after, well, I'm done hogging the mic here in the Millvale studios. This is the River's Edge, found at riversedgepgh.com. And I'm Matt Gajtka. This is Gajtka's Got Game. We're on the air in some form or fashion every Friday at 8 a.m. And getting up early with me is my colleague at dkpittsburghsports.com. He covers the Pitt Panthers, both football and basketball, really anything athletically concerned over there in Oakland. But he has been known to fill in on the Steelers. You might see him at the Lemieux complex in Cranberry this fall and winter with the Penguins and in a whole bunch of other spots. He's a man from Youngstown, a place where I've worked, so I can appreciate being on the borderline between Pittsburgh Nation and Cleveland Nation. Lance joins me right now on the line. Thank you, sir. And how are things on this autumn morning?
Things are well, man. Hey, morning coffee, maybe a little bit breakfast after we get done talking, but I'm happy to be here.
Beautiful. Glad to give you the wake-up call. I've got the coffee in hand as well here. Now, like I mentioned, you and I both work for dkpittsburghsports.com, but we also have the Youngstown connection in common. What was it like growing up in Youngstown? Are there more Pittsburgh fans or Cleveland fans in that area? Or maybe is it just does it differ based on the sport?
Really, Matt, I'm surprised that this is the first time I've been asked about that since I moved here about 3 years ago.
Yes. Okay.
It's really incredible because people don't realize there are a ton of Steelers fans in Youngstown. I think that's the one sport that you do see a huge divide. Honestly, growing up there are probably more Steeler fans than there are Browns fans. You can't really put your finger on it. A lot of it is that a lot of the people, personally, me growing up, a lot of people's parents, people I grew up with, parents are from Pittsburgh, they have family in the area, and quite frankly, a lot of people my age didn't really grow up watching a football team that played in Ohio. The Browns were non-existent for 5 years, and that's obviously has an impact, and there's not a whole lot of history there. The whole Bernie codes are a thing. Bernie went to Boardman High School, which is where I went, so
right.
You have some followers who love Bernie and love the Browns of that era, but when it comes to the Pirates and the Penguins, not really a whole lot of attention in that town.
I found there's also a TV issue there with, is that still the case where, was it Time Warner wasn't in a certain spot or they didn't carry Root Sports? So that'll certainly affect a fan base too. I know south of town, I lived just a little bit south of Youngstown, and we got Root Sports, but my friend who lived north of town did not get it, even though we were maybe 10 minutes away. So that has an effect as well.
Yeah, I think it was Time Warner didn't get it, but I had Armstrong Cable, which was the other cable company Armstrong got.
Yeah, that's what I had too.
I was able to watch the Penguins growing up, and the Pirates a little bit. I grew up watching the Indians, though. I really didn't. Part of it was maybe the success of the one team over the other, but
sure. Well, so you went to Kent State, so you are certainly an Ohioan, but what has the transition been like? You had your first full-time gig out of school down in Washington, PA with the Observer Reporter, and now, of course, covering Pitt. How would you compare the two sports-crazed areas? Is there more of a pessimistic bent up in Ohio? Maybe that's changed these days with the Cavs winning and the Indians once again challenging for a division title.
Matt, Cleveland sports fans are very, very different. They're somewhat cautiously optimistic, but they prepare for the worst, and I guess you can't blame them with all of the bad luck that's kind of hit that town when it comes to its sports teams. Even the Indians have been, it seems like every time they come close, something awful happens, whether it comes to the 2 World Series losses or, this city, though, there's always that feeling that they can win a championship any year, no matter what the roster looks like. And I kind of admire that because, as a Cleveland sports fan growing up, you never thought that you could win a chance. There was never that feeling, and you always waited for something to go wrong. But again, I always tell people in Pittsburgh this, they don't want to hear it, but people in Pittsburgh are very, very similar to the ones in Ohio. It's incredible. That's why, coming here, sometimes we move from one area to the other. I know, Matt, you've jumped around a little bit. You could probably attest to this. That
Sure.
people in different areas are different. When it comes to values or just the way that they view certain things. But those two states, I mean, in particular, maybe Youngstown, Northeast Ohio, and Pittsburgh, they love their sports. They're really passionate about it, and you got to love that.
No doubt, that's what keeps us employed, right? So,
partially that's what I'm saying, but still.
No doubt. Yeah, you're alluding to. I have lived, like as I mentioned, in Youngstown, but in Michigan too. That's when you get to Michigan, that's the Midwest. People call Ohio the Midwest. I'm not sure I would say that either. I don't think Cleveland is a Midwestern city. I think Cleveland, like Pittsburgh, considers itself more of a northeastern town. Would you agree with my feel on that?
Yeah, I feel the same way, Matt. I mean, it's definitely not Midwest. I mean, it doesn't really, I don't know, Northeast. It's different. It's very similar to Pittsburgh. I don't even know what I would classify Pittsburgh as.
It's a hybrid, right?
Yeah, I mean, they both kind of are. I mean, of course, a lot of it's Midwestern values, that sort of thing, but they're kind of just there and very similar in that regard.
That's the new tagline for Pittsburgh and Cleveland. We're just there.
They're just there.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, though.
Deal with it. I read a great book.
Two great cities.
I read a great book, sorry to cut you off, by a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette columnist named Brian O'Neill, who I always enjoyed and continue to enjoy his work. He called Pittsburgh the Paris of Appalachia, and me being from West Virginia, I could understand that. There is a bit of not a southern feel, but a mountain feel to the edges, to the periphery of Pittsburgh that Cleveland doesn't really have, of course, too. So they're two different cities, but I've long contended, ever since I did live in Youngstown for 2 years, that they're more similar than they are different. Lance Lysowski is my guest. He covers the Pitt Panthers for DKPittsburghSports.com. And Lance, I mentioned that you filled in while we were between beat reporters at the website for the Steelers, on the Steelers beat. You're up there in Latrobe. You've covered high school sports too. How would you say what would you say are the differences between covering the levels of sports, and how is it different in terms of routine for a reporter? Because high school, I've done that. I've done college. I've done pro. And I'm interested to see what your perspective is as someone who's had similar experiences.
Matt, high school it's certainly a challenge, especially when I was working at the Observer Reporter. I was covering 30 high schools. I was the main high school sports reporter. So you get to not only
right.
worry about one sport or one team, you get to worry about every sport for every team at 30 high schools. You have to kind of have your eyes and ears everywhere, have connections, have these coaches and athletic directors' phone numbers, keep in touch. It's that sort of thing. I mean, when you move on to the pros and the colleges, it's one team. It's developing those sources on one beat that, honestly are more difficult to obtain, at those organizations because they're all kind of sealed and closed shut. And I mean, even Pitt, which in the world of college football, it's not like it's unusual, but Pitt's very closed off. They don't want any information getting out. But the one thing I would always say that a lot of young reporters are always afraid to go cover high school sports. They want to jump in and cover colleges or pros. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, Matt, you grew
Sure.
up wanting to do this. You want to do it at the highest level. But I think a lot of people don't realize how much high school sports really prepares you to be in that locker room setting, to ask questions, to know what stories to pursue, and to really have a better news judgment. I think that's the one thing. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, sure. It's a good testing ground, and in full candor, it's good to have a spot where you can make some mistakes, and it's not the most obvious thing in the world. If you make an error on a high school story, it sucks, no doubt, but you need that training ground. That's what college is for, and I think that's why when you have an entry-level gig, like you and I have both had in this business, you get to experience some trial and error and figure out what works and what doesn't, and what you read in a journalism textbook often doesn't match up with what you see in the real world, so you have to apply it in those ways. So yeah, I would completely agree with you there that it's a nice training ground, and you know what? At the same time, every person has the same value, so if it's a high school story could get as many clicks and as many reads as anything that you do on a pro or a college beat. So it's not like it's necessarily low profile either. Everyone knows someone playing high school sports, right?
Oh, people really care about it. I mean, especially I know the area that I worked in down in Washington, Greene County. They love high school sports, and a lot of places do. It's when you get to a sports crazed region of the United States, you get the right paper. I know the Observer Reporter, they covered the Steelers, but the pro coverage was often not as well read as the high school stuff. Steelers was really well read, but when it comes to the Pirates or the Penguins, they don't cover it, just Associated Press. So a lot of people who pick up that paper are looking for high school sports content. So it was what I looked at it as, Matt, is you can only learn so much in a classroom in college. And I think when you actually get that first job, you get that first opportunity, you realize that, wow, I have a lot of learning to do. So the way I really treated it, and what I tell a lot of young journalists is, handle it as grad school. Learn, meet as many people as you can, make mistakes, find your voice, and it's a really fun beat to work because you can tell unique stories, and there's not a shortage of stories to be told.
And one thing I always appreciated about covering high schools is that typically the subjects are very willing and open, and they're happy to get the coverage because there's no other way for them to get their stories out. If you're covering Pitt, they have their own website. Same deal with the Pirates or whatever else that might be out there in big-time sports. But small time, there's still there are ways for them to get their own message out, but it's not quite as widespread. It's not quite as effective as it is at other levels. So they still, in a lot of ways, rely upon the independent news media to get those stories in the public eye. You're listening to Gajtka Got Game. Lance Lysowski is my guest. And Lance, I know that you're a big football fan, and that's part of the reason why you're in this business. Football has come under siege in recent years, and for good reason, for insensitivity, for ignorance regarding head injuries, whether you're talking high school, college, or pros. So my question to you is, how would you tinker with how football, or would you completely alter the way that football has gone about the reporting of head injuries, the treatment of head injuries, and do you think it can be saved and fixed in a way for the current landscape where we learn more and more about concussions and even subconcussive hits and their after effects?
Well, from everything, the studies I've read, the sample size isn't there yet, but it really sounds like the advancements they're making and how they're teaching kids how to tackle is really making strides. You're seeing, kids at a younger level, you're seeing less concussions at that age. But, Matt, the one thing that's really concerning to me is that the NFL has still done a terrible job at recognizing when a guy has a concussion during a football game.
Mm-hmm.
I think the last couple of weeks in particular, Cam Newton is one of the players that blatantly you could see had a concussion. He took a head-to-head hit. There wasn't really much of a test done. And I think until the NFL really starts taking this serious, because, the tests are there. The results are there. There's no way you can ignore this any longer with all the cases that there have been. Something has to be done. I think that more players, I think some of the rule changes that have gone about, the fines, you're seeing guys play a little bit different. But anytime you get these athletes, NFL players now are built incredibly different than they were 30 to 40 years ago.
Sure.
You can make advancements in the helmets guys are wearing to kind of better prepare them for those blows, but when it comes down to guys that are bigger, faster, and stronger, and if you don't recognize when something does happen, that's a real issue.
Gut feel, 30 years from now, or whatever time period you want to pick out, what does football look like? Is it drastically different from what we see today?
I don't think it is. I hate to look at it from this perspective, but there's too much money involved. I think
that's for sure.
It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for them to make drastic changes to a product that people love so much. Look at the things they've done the last couple of years. Everything from the kickoff rule to head-to-head hits. All you do is hear fans complain. You hear fans, really voice how frustrated they are that some of these plays, some of these hits, some of these other things have been taken out of it. And really, Matt, if players are still willing to get drafted, to sign pro contracts, and to put themselves through this rigorous game, there's nothing like it in this world. They're just going to keep doing it. Yeah, they're going to make adjustments. They're going to try to make this game as safe as possible, but I can't see them making overhauls and kind of changing the way the game is played.
That's Lance Lysowski. Lance, thanks for the time, and we'll have to have you on at some point further on down the road, but tell the listeners and viewers where they can find you not just on our website, but on social media as well.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Lysowski, Lysowski. Keeping it simple, Matt.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Although your name is still slightly easier to spell than mine, and I will be envious of that. You can't really sound mine out. You can sound out Lysowski, though. And I appreciate having you on board. We'll talk to you soon. I'm sure I'll be seeing you soon. I know that.
Of course, Matt. Take it easy. Have a good weekend, and talk soon.
All right, that's Lance. I'm Matt. We shall return here in the Millvale studios for the final number and the final segment. Oh, there we go. He hung up on Gajtka Game. Be back in a moment.
Hey, everybody out there. This is Mike Sasson, stand-up comedian, broadcaster, all-around great guy. Starting July 19th, guess what you're going to get? That's right, another white guy's opinion. It's the Michael Sasson Show. It's going to be premiering July 19th at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Another white guy's opinion. That's what you're getting right now. Sorry. Apologies to all of the listeners and viewers. That line from Mike Sasson gets me every time. I never expect it for whatever reason. I guess I'm a slow learner. You might be a slow learner if you're listening to this program once again, but to the loyal listeners, thank you. It has been fun and to be part of this station as it evolves and changes. It's been a very vital, local, grassroots operation and something that has been exciting to me to play a small part in. I'm on the air for an hour tops a week, so it's not like I'm putting in as much blood, sweat, and tears. There's a cliche. We'll ban that one. As Brian, as Tom, and the rest of the staff is here at the River's Edge. And, of course, it wouldn't be possible without listeners like you. That sounds like a PBS type of a promo. But, hey, speaking of that, you can give us some funds through Patreon, patreon.com. If you help support us, and it can be as little as $1, but if you help support us, we will speak your name on these, I was going to say airwaves, but they're not airwaves anymore, on these bits and bytes.
I always call them net waves.
Net waves, okay. We'll go with that. On these net waves, these crazy net waves that we're riding these days, we will give you a shout. I don't know if that'll be a thrill to you or not, but that's the least we can do, literally, for your support. And not just this show, but every program on our growing network. And that always includes the 24/7 stream, local music, almost constantly playing on the River's Edge. And we are at riversedgepgh.com. Unless you're watching on Facebook Live, that is most likely how you're accessing us right now. Let's move on to the final number and put a bow on Gajtka Game for another week, this September 23rd, 2016. The final number is 10, as the Pirates begin their final 10 games of the regular season. And 7 of those will be at home. I'll have coverage on probably 5 or 6 of those for DKPittsburghSports.com. Yes, our views have gone down since the Pirates tanked at the start of September. And when I say tanked, I don't mean intentionally lost. I mean they just plummeted down the standings. They lost 8 in a row. They had a 2-8 homestand. And even after winning 7 of 11 on the road, which, give them credit, the season could have gone completely down the toilet with their return to the road, but it did not. They beat 3 inferior teams fairly routinely, so give them credit for that. They weren't discouraged enough by their performance earlier this month to completely fall off, so you got to hand it to them there. There will be at least some meaning, even though they are 4.5 games back in the wild card standing, some meaning to the final 10 games. A miracle is still possible, but not anywhere near probable for these final tilts, final games in the 2016 season. It's been almost a historically up and down year, and I've spoken on this subject in the past, but no team in baseball has as many 4-game win streaks and 4-game losing streaks as the Pirates do, and it adds up to them coming home with a record of dead even 76 and 76. They'll play the Nationals and the Cubs this homestand. Not easy competition, although you could also look at it from the perspective that these two teams will not have much to play for, as they have already, well, the Cubs have already locked up the NL Central. The Nationals are close to cinching the NL East, so the intensity won't be quite as high as it would be if they were fighting it out for a final playoff spot. And the wild card will still be enjoyable to watch, with the Pirates and the Marlins on the periphery, but 3 teams squaring off for 2 positions. And the possibility of that 3-team tie, which would be spectacular. That would lead to quite the number of permutations, and you can get caught up on that. There have been a few articles written on that subject, ESPN.com, NBCSports.com recently, in particular, that I've enjoyed going through all those processes to close it out. If we do need that in Major League Baseball. But for the Pirates, if they're not part of it, they'll be on the outside of the postseason picture for the first time since 2012. And again, meaningful September baseball, just barely the case this year, as they fell out of it at the end of August and into September. And quite candidly for me, it's been a challenging gig. I have covered more games than anybody in this market. And not that it's challenging because they haven't been able to build upon the previous 3 seasons, but it's just a grind. And the 162-game season, challenging for the players, challenging also for reporters. There's a reason that baseball writers don't do nearly as much as they used to. The demands of digital media put more on a reporter than there used to be. It used to be you would just file a notebook piece and a game recap each day and maybe some breaking news, but you had time to put it together. Now everything's got to be now. It's got to be immediate. So it wears you down, and this has been the most challenging gig of my career, going on more than a decade now in sports media. Well, closer to 15 years if you want to count the stuff done when I was in high school and college, but the final number is 10, and I've had about 10 years outside of school and in the real world, so to speak, and this would be the one thing that I would challenge everyone to do, to try at least once, is to cover a full baseball season from spring training, the start of that, all the way through to the end. It looks like we won't go as deep as we thought we might with the Pirates season. However, I can gain a new appreciation for those in the game who constantly talk about the need to conserve energy, the need to leave something in the tank. I've tried to do that, and I've had a few days off this week to unplug and then get right back into it for the final stretch. I know it's been fatiguing for fans, and I also know that I have gained new perspective on just the challenges of this game. And baseball doesn't look that difficult on the face of it when you compare it to a sport like football or hockey or basketball or soccer. It's not constant motion. In fact, it's the opposite of that at times, and I think to its detriment in terms of attracting fans and attention. But you are out there. You have to have your wits about you, and that's one thing that I will take away from this season is how difficult it is to maintain that level, whether you're reporting or whether you are playing or managing or coaching our oldest pastime, if not necessarily our greatest pastime anymore in this country. Thanks for watching Gajtka Game. Thanks for listening. Thank you to Brian Crawford for producing this week's show, and to Lance Lysowski for being today's expert witness. One more time before I sign off, this is Matt Gajtka reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. And trucking along it is. Moving into next week, I'll be back in the studio in 1 week for the next edition of this very program. Until then, have an awesome weekend and a great week moving on into the end of September.